From Packard to Pontiac, from glory to the grave, these are the last cars ever made by once great automakers. Some went out with a whisper, others with a burnout. But each one tells the same story: what happens when innovation runs out of road. Let's begin. Number 14, Hudson Hornet. By 1957, the roar of the Hudson Hornet had become a whisper. The final car to wear the Hudson badge rolled out of Kenosha, Wisconsin that year. A two-tone green and white 1957 Hornet built not by Hudson, but by American Motors Corporation. And that was the problem. Hudson had been a powerhouse. In the early 1950s, it dominated NASCAR with its legendary step-down chassis, a low-slung design that gave it unbeatable handling. Drivers like Marshall Teague and Herb Thomas made the Hornet a household name. In 1952 alone, Hudson's won 27 NASCAR races, a record of dominance Detroit couldn't ignore. But racing trophies don't pay the bills. By mid-decade, Hudson was losing money, and in 1954, it merged with Nash to form AMC. The move was meant to save both brands. Instead, it erased Hudson's identity. The last Hornets were just Nashes in disguise, wearing Hudson grills and nameplates. Underneath the tail fins and chrome, the heart was gone. That final Hornet was sold to a Hudson dealer in Michigan, who displayed it in his showroom for years. A conversation piece from a time when Hudson was feared on the track and respected on the street. Number 13, Plymouth Prowler. Most brands go out quietly. Plymouth decided to drop the mic. On June 28, 2001, the very last Plymouth rolled off the line at Detroit's Conner Avenue assembly plant, a bright Inca gold pearl Prowler that looked more like a concept car than a farewell. It had the stance of a hot rod, the heart of a V6, and the soul of a brand that refused to die without one last burnout. The Prowler wasn't meant to save Plymouth. It was meant to remind everyone why Plymouth mattered. Born in an era of bland sedans, it was a design experiment turned production miracle. Aluminum chassis, open front wheels, and a body that looked straight out of a 1930s fever dream. Under the hood, a 3.5-liter V6 pushed out 253 horsepower through a rear-mounted transmission. A weird, wonderful engineering risk that only Plymouth would have greenlit. And yet, it came too late. Daimler Chrysler had already decided the brand was redundant, a casualty of German efficiency and corporate overlap. Why sell both Dodge and Plymouth when they built nearly the same cars? What they didn't understand was that Plymouth wasn't just Dodge's twin, it was Dodge's spirit. Workers signed the last Prowler's hood before it rolled into the Walter P. Chrysler Museum, giving Plymouth something few dead brands ever get: a proper goodbye. Number 12, Studebaker Cruiser. By the time Studebaker built its last car, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was carved into the factory floor. On March 17, 1966, at the Hamilton, Ontario plant, the final Studebaker, a burgundy cruiser with a black vinyl roof, rolled off the line. It wasn't a celebration, it was a countdown that everyone could hear ticking for years. Studebaker had survived almost everything: world wars, depressions, the switch from wagons to engines. But it couldn't survive the 1960s. The cruiser itself wasn't bad, it just wasn't Studebaker. It was basically a rebadged Lark, dressed up with a new grille and extra chrome. Even the engine, a Chevy Source 283 V8, was borrowed. It was reliable, sure, but it was also an admission the company couldn't even afford to make its own engines anymore. When the announcement came down that March 4th would be the last day of production, nobody was surprised. The plant had been running on fumes, building just 20 cars a day from leftover parts. Around 700 workers lost their jobs that week, and a company that had built its first wagons in 1852 built its last car in 1966. That final cruiser went to a Studebaker executive who probably knew it was history the moment he turned the key. The plant shut down within days. Quiet, cold, forgotten. Studebaker's death wasn't caused by one bad car or one bad decision. It was death by 1,000 small compromises. Number 11, Oldsmobile Alero. When the last Oldsmobile Alero rolled off the line in Lansing, Michigan on April 29, 2004, it wasn't just another car leaving the factory. It was a funeral disguised as a shift change. Oldsmobile wasn't some startup that fizzled out after a bad quarter. It was America's oldest car brand, founded in 1897, older than Ford, older than Buick, and once the innovation powerhouse of General Motors. They built the first mass-produced car, the first automatic transmission, and even launched the rocket bucket V8, but by the early 2000s, Oldsmobile had forgotten what made it special. The final car, a dark cherry metallic Alero sedan, had signatures from every assembly line worker under the hood and on the frame. That wasn't marketing, that was mourning. These were men and women who'd spent decades building Oldsmobiles, watching the brand's identity dissolve into a sea of rebadged Chevys. The Alero itself wasn't bad, 170 horsepower from a 3.4-liter V6 front-wheel drive, decent reliability, but it was generic, a corporate ghost of a company that once defined innovation. General Motors had announced Oldsmobile's end in 2000, but it took 4 long years for the brand to finally die. The workers gathered that April morning didn't celebrate a legacy. They watched 107 years of history drive away on a flatbed. Today, that last Alero sits in the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Michigan, started once a month to keep the fluids circulating, as if the company might still come back. Number 10, Mercury Mariner. Mercury didn't crash, it simply faded away. On January 4th, 2011, the final Mercury Grand Marquis rolled off the line at Ford's St. Thomas Assembly Plant in Ontario, closing the book on a brand that had once been synonymous with mid-century cool. But the Mariner, a modest compact SUV, told the real story of Mercury's slow decline. By the 2000s, Mercury had become a ghost. Fords with fancier badges and slightly higher price tags. The Mariner was no exception. It shared nearly everything with the Ford Escape. Same chassis, same engines, same interior. The only difference was a waterfall grille and a logo no one looked twice at. And that was the tragedy. Mercury was born in 1938, Edsel Ford's experiment to bridge the gap between the everyman's Ford and the elite Lincoln. For decades, it delivered muscle coupes, cushy sedans, and elegant highway cruisers that blended class with accessibility. Cars like the Cougar and Marauder made Mercury aspirational without being unattainable. But by the 2000s, it had lost its identity. Annual sales had plummeted from nearly 600,000 in the late 70s to under 100,000. And Ford's One Ford strategy under CEO Alan Mulally didn't leave room for nostalgia. The last Mariner slipped quietly off the line in late 2010. No fanfare, no press, no commemorative plaque, just another SUV in a long line of lookalikes. The final Grand Marquis, fittingly white, was kept by a Michigan dealer who couldn't bear to sell it. Number 9, Saturn Sky. For Saturn, the dream was simple: build a different kind of car company. One without haggling, without gimmicks, without the arrogance that had defined Detroit for decades. And for a while, it worked. But on October 7th, 2009, as the last Saturn Outlook SUV rolled off the line in Lansing, Michigan, that dream finally ran out of road. Still, it wasn't the Outlook that symbolized Saturn's end. It was the Sky Red Line, a bright yellow turbocharged roadster that proved what Saturn could have been. The Sky Red Line was stunning, a low-slung two-seater with curves that looked more Italian than American. Beneath its hood, a 2.0-liter turbocharged Ecotec engine produced 260 horsepower, giving it sports car performance for under $30,000. It wasn't just fast, it was focused. The Sky handled better than anything GM had built in years, a rare moment of passion in a company obsessed with spreadsheets. But GM didn't know what to do with it. Saturn had lost its identity, morphing from an import fighter into just another division pushing rebadged Chevrolets. A near sale to racing legend Roger Penske almost saved the brand, but the deal collapsed when GM couldn't guarantee continued production. When the last Sky Red Line left the Wilmington, Delaware plant in early 2009, the workers knew it was over. They didn't sign the frame or celebrate, they just quietly watched it drive away. Today, that car sits in a private collection, still wearing its original paint. A snapshot of what Saturn once promised, a future where Detroit did things differently. Number 8, Packard Patrician. If Cadillac was the king of luxury, Packard was the gentleman who taught it manners. But by 1958, that gentleman was broke, desperate, and wearing someone else's suit. The final Packard, a 1958 Patrician, rolled off the South Bend, Indiana assembly line on July 13, 1958. It wore the body of a Studebaker, the soul of a Packard, and the sadness of a company that had once built cars for presidents, movie stars, and millionaires. Packard's story was one of pride. and how pride can kill faster than death. When Packard merged with Studebaker in 1954, it was supposed to be a lifeline. Instead, it became an anchor. The last true Packard had already been built by 1956. The so-called 1958 models were just rebadged Studebakers with extra chrome and fancy trim. Under the hood sat a 289 cubic inch V8 making 225 horsepower, strong enough to move 4,000 pounds of steel and broken dreams. It still had touches of luxury, leather seats, real wood trim, but it wasn't the same. Packard had gone from competing with Cadillac to pretending to. Only 2,622 Patricians were built that year. When the last one rolled out, painted two-tone blue and white, the factory workers didn't cheer. They didn't even pose for photos. They just watched it leave and went home. That car marked the end of a lineage stretching back to 1899, a brand that built limousines for presidents, aircraft engines for World War II, and the kind of craftsmanship Detroit forgot how to make. Today, surviving 58 Patricians are rare, not because collectors forgot them, but because most people wanted to forget Packard's final chapter. Number 7. Nash Metropolitan. In an era obsessed with tail fins, horsepower, and chrome, the Nash Metropolitan looked like it had been built by toy designers. Small, colorful, and almost cartoonishly cute. But that was exactly the point. When the final Metropolitan rolled off the line in April 1962 at the Austin factory in Birmingham, England, it marked the end of one of the strangest success stories in American automotive history. The Metropolitan was designed in Detroit, but built in Britain. It was America's first true subcompact, long before gas crises made small cars fashionable. With its tiny 1.5-liter Austin engine making just 52 horsepower, it wasn't built for speed, it was built for charm. Two-tone paint, chrome trim, and bright interiors made it feel like a car designed for 1950s optimism, something you'd see in a Norman Rockwell painting parked outside a diner. It was especially popular with women and young drivers, marketed as the perfect second car. But by the early 60s, the writing was on the wall. The Volkswagen Beetle was dominating the small car market, and Detroit's giants were starting to roll out compact competitors. The Metropolitan suddenly looked like a toy in a world full of real cars. The last one, painted coral and white, rolled out quietly. No ceremony, no speeches. Nash had technically already merged with Hudson to become American Motors, and the badge was living on borrowed time. Today, the Metropolitan has a cult following. Not because it was fast, but because it dared to be small when everyone else was chasing size. Number 6. Edsel Corsair. Few cars in history have crashed harder, faster, or louder than the Edsel. Ford spent $250 million launching it, an enormous gamble in the 1950s, and by the time it hit showrooms, they were already out of luck. The Edsel Corsair, especially the 1959 model, became the poster child for corporate hubris. It was supposed to fill a gap between Ford and Mercury, but the only thing it filled was Ford's balance sheet with red ink. The car itself wasn't terrible. It came with a 332 cubic inch V8 making 225 horsepower and a push-button transmission built right into the steering wheel. Futuristic stuff for its time, but it was heavy, over-designed, and worst of all, badly timed. Launched during the 1958 recession, the Edsel tried to sell medium-priced cars when Americans were suddenly cutting back. Even worse, the design was controversial. Its vertical grille, meant to look sophisticated, ended up being compared to a horse collar, and other things we can't repeat. By late 1959, Ford had seen enough. On November 19, 1959, the final Edsel, a turquoise and white Ranger convertible, rolled off the line in Louisville, Kentucky. Ford didn't even let photographers attend. They wanted the whole thing buried. That last car went to a local dealer who quietly sold it to a collector. Ironically, today, Edsels are worth more than Fords of the same era simply because so few survived the crusher. Number 5. Kaiser Manhattan. The Kaiser Manhattan was the kind of car that proved you could do almost everything right and still lose. When the last Manhattan rolled out of Willow Run, Michigan in early 1955, it marked the end of the Kaiser Fraser Corporation's American dream, a dream that began with wartime ambition and ended in quiet defeat. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, the man who built Liberty Ships and the Hoover Dam, thought he could build cars with the same formula: massive factories, bold ideas, and relentless optimism. And at first he did. Kaisers were stylish, innovative, and loaded with features other brands wouldn't adopt for years. The final Manhattan was no slouch. It came with a supercharged 226 cubic inch straight six, pumping out 140 horsepower, impressive for its class. It featured a wraparound windshield, optional air conditioning, tinted glass, and a padded dashboard. All futuristic touches in 1955. But innovation costs money, and Kaiser was bleeding cash. The post-war boom was fading, and the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, were swallowing every independent automaker in sight. Between 1946 and 1955, Kaiser lost over $100 million, an impossible hole to climb out of. That last Manhattan, a bamboo yellow and cream two-tone beauty, went unsold for months, sitting in a Detroit dealership while customers lined up for Chevys and Buicks instead. Eventually, it was sold at a loss to a local businessman who drove it until 1962. Number 4, Holden Commodore. For over 160 years, Holden was Australia's pride, the homegrown badge that built cars tough enough for the outback and fast enough for Bathurst. But by the time the final Commodore rolled off the line in Adelaide on October 20th, 2017, the factory floor was silent except for one sound, the crackle of a burnout. That last car, a red VF2 SSV Redline Commodore, wasn't a sedan, it was a statement. Under the hood sat a 6.2-liter LS 3V8 making 410 horsepower, a defiant middle finger to the corporate suits who said Australia didn't need its own car industry anymore. When the burnout smoke cleared, workers cheered, and then they cried, because everyone knew what it meant. It wasn't just Holden's last car, it was the end of car manufacturing in Australia, period. Holden's death wasn't caused by bad cars. In fact, their cars were world class, but globalization made it impossible to survive. Building cars in Australia was too expensive, too niche, and too far from the markets that mattered. By 2017, even Ford and Toyota had packed up and left. After that final Commodore, Holden limped along selling rebadged imports until GM pulled the plug completely in 2020, retiring the brand after 164 years. Today, that last Commodore sits proudly in the National Motor Museum of South Australia, still wearing the tire marks it left on the factory floor. Number 3, Pontiac G6. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Pontiac, the brand that gave us muscle icons like the GTO and Firebird, didn't die in a fiery crash or corporate scandal. It quietly ran out of heartbeat under fluorescent factory lights. On November 25th, 2009, at the Orion Assembly Plant in Michigan, the very last Pontiac rolled off the line, a white 2010 G6 sedan, a car so ordinary it barely knew it was closing an 84-year chapter of American performance history. The workers didn't clap, there were no executives giving speeches, no banners, no countdown, just one more mid-sized sedan easing toward the shipping dock, and the end of a legend. Pontiac's death wasn't a mystery, it was collateral damage. When General Motors filed for bankruptcy during the Great Recession, the government's restructuring plan demanded sacrifices. Pontiac was one of them. The brand that once sold over 1 million cars a year was down to a quarter of that by 2008, and most of them were rebadged Chevys pretending to be something they weren't. The final G6 was sent to GM's Heritage Center, where it still sits today, parked beside the legends that made the badge famous: GTOs, Firebirds, Grand Prix. Together, they tell a story of a brand that lived fast, sold bold, and went out in silence. Number 2, Scion FRS. When Toyota launched Scion in 2003, the goal was simple: sell affordable, customizable cars to a new generation of drivers. What they didn't expect was that the new generation didn't really want cars at all. By 2016, Scion was out of gas, literally and figuratively. The final Scion branded vehicle, a Barcelona Red 2016 TC, rolled off the line in Japan that August. But the car that truly defined Scion's final breath wasn't the TC. It was the FRS, a car that was everything the brand should have been from the start. Built in partnership with Subaru, the FRS was a purist's dream. A 2.0-liter boxer engine, 200 horsepower, rear-wheel drive, and one of the sharpest manual gearboxes ever fitted to a car under $30,000. Lightweight, balanced, and designed purely for fun, it was the antidote to bloated modern cars. It should have saved Scion, but by then, the brand's identity had dissolved. What began as a youth-focused experiment had turned into a marketing riddle. The FRS was a hit with enthusiasts, just not the one Scion was built for. Most buyers were in their 30s and 40s, not teenagers. On February 3rd, 2016, Toyota announced that Scion would be discontinued after 13 years and roughly 1 million cars sold. The FRS survived, rebadged as the Toyota 86, while the rest of the lineup faded into anonymity. The last TC was raffled off for charity. The final FRS quietly transitioned to a new badge, and Scion's experiment officially ended. Number 1. Mitsubishi Lancer. Once upon a time, the Mitsubishi Lancer was a global icon, a rally legend with a trunk full of trophies and a badge that made Subaru nervous. But by 2024, the Lancer nameplate wasn't roaring through mountain passes anymore. It was sitting in rental lots. The last Lancer rolled off the line in August 2024, ending nearly 50 years of production. There was no ceremony, no final photo op, just another white sedan built for fleets, not fans, quietly rolling into anonymity. This was the same name that gave us the Lancer Evolution, a car that conquered WRC stages with all-wheel drive precision and a turbocharged Ford G63 engine that could turn dirt into art. But the Evo was gone by 2016, replaced by corporate crossovers with fake vents and meaningless badges.